So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining Lakehead University's virtual speaker series. Your audio and video is automatically disabled by default, and at no time is your video or your computer screen accessible by the moderator or presenters or others taking part. Also, just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded. And at the end of the presentation, there will be questions and answers. And if during the presentation you think of any questions, you can send me a direct private message. As we begin today, I would like to acknowledge the original custodians of this land and pay respect to the elders past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and the hopes of Indigenous peoples. I would also like to recognize that our Thunder Bay and Aurelia campuses are on the traditional lands of some of the country's Indigenous peoples. In Thunder Bay, Lakehead University resides on the traditional land of the Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. And in Aurelia, Lakehead University resides on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe people and the Rama First Nations. We also acknowledge the history that many nations hold in the areas and look forward to respectful relations with the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in the spirit of reconciliation. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Frank Cappadocia. He is Associate Vice President of Administration and Community Engagement at Lakehead University's Aurelia campus. Through the course of his 30-plus years in the post-secondary sector, Frank has had several senior leadership positions at Ryerson, York, and Lakehead. Known for his solutions-focused, mission-driven approach, Frank is routinely engaging in coaching, mentoring, and developing new leaders. Today's presentation, Volunteering to Victory, will provide examples of outstanding volunteer leaders and the approaches that they use to making volunteerism a part of who they are. So take it away, Frank.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I know how precious time is, so I'm going to be going through my slide deck at a pretty good clip, and as was noted, this will be recorded, and so you will be able to go back and view different sections if you'd like, and you absolutely will be able to ask questions, and I'm really looking forward to a conversation with folks at the conclusion of this. So let's talk about a couple of things, starting with what do I know about volunteerism, what it is and why we should do it, what effective volunteer leadership looks like. And we're going to talk about some strengths and weaknesses that volunteer teams face, and then what works and doesn't work in terms of connecting to volunteers. And then, of course, we're going to go to some questions at the end. So 2021 is the International Year of Volunteers, and it marks the 20th anniversary of that designation through the United Nations and the launching of the Canadian Code of Volunteer Involvement. So this is a special year for any of us who are interested in volunteerism. As a definition, volunteering is any activity in which time is given freely to benefit another person, group, or cause. And I think the three key things that I really want to emphasize there are activity, given, and benefit, because there are circumstances that I've experienced where the benefits really were questionable. Whether it was given freely or not is, again, an interesting dialogue. And the fact that is that it has to be an activity. It's an engagement, and it involves that as a part of what volunteering is all about. So what do I actually know about volunteerism and about volunteering? And I'll just start with a very quick story. My first experience as a volunteer was really tagging along with my mom, who was raising money for the Canadian Cancer Society and was doing that because my grandfather had passed away of cancer. And here, you know, as a very young kid, and I think I was about 8 at the time, we were trotting along to different neighbors, knocking on doors, and she'd engage in these various conversations. And I thought it was the most interesting and amazing thing that we would go up to ostensibly strangers' homes and ask them to contribute money towards a cause. And the fact is that she was very successful in doing that. And my mom ended up volunteering with the Canadian Cancer Society for over 30 years. In terms of me, I've had a series of experiences there, and I'll talk about each of them in a minute. But the two that are really sort of stood out for me is my work with York Is You, which is the student alumni program of York University, in which we had over 300 plus volunteers engaged with us. And those volunteers, many of them were international students who at the time, as I was director of York, couldn't work outside of the university. So they were really limited in terms of what they could do. And York as U became a home base for those 300 plus volunteers. What was most interesting is at the end of the year when we had our volunteer celebration, most of those volunteers gave at least 100 hours of their time. Actually, the vast majority gave much more than that. And so when you look at that relative to that combined pool, we're talking about literally thousands of volunteer hours that were being contributed to the community. And all of the roles that I've played, whether it was as a director of an organization or a past president or chairperson, I served as a volunteer because I fundamentally believe in the importance and the significance that volunteers provide to their organizations and to the communities that we're all part of. So in doing my research, I came across this, and I have to admit, I didn't remember this at all, but in 1992, I was a student administrative council president of Humber College's Lakeshore campus. And when I was president, I was approached by the administration to work with Volunteers Etobicoke, which was really keen to try to provide community support. And they had a number of organizations that they were linked into. And so at Humber, as SAC president, I was very keen to provide an opportunity where our students could benefit from those volunteer opportunities, enhance their own job capabilities, and of course, benefit the community that we're part of. So I thought this was a little bit nostalgic, slightly thinner, healthier Frank there, but I remember as I was collecting this information and looking back and saying, wow, that was a great initiative that we were able to provide, and an example of where a post-secondary partner can really connect with an organization to offer those volunteer opportunities. And Lakehead's had tremendous successes there as well that I'll get into in a second. But before I get into any of that, I do want to talk about some of the greatest strengths and weaknesses that volunteers face. And I can speak from personal experience as well as the information that I've collected over the years. And relative to strengths, I think volunteers fundamentally have a belief in themselves and that their ability to change the present, the current state of the organization, the entity, the partnership, the family that they're involving themselves in, the ability to impact the future. And so the cognition that by changing things right here and now, it can actually influence the future and make the organizations that they're part of, or the communities, or the universities or colleges better places. Their power base is really the transition of an intellectual and physical conveyance. So what they're giving is intellectual and physical capital. Sometimes as a board member, that's principally intellectual, you're engaged in a lot of conversations. Often in the Heart and Stroke Foundation, where we're doing what was called P2P, or person to person, still one of their principal methods of fundraising, you're actually going door to door, and there's literally a physical capacity issue. If you're working in a food bank or the OSPCA or any other organization that do require a lot of that physical capital, that's a real part of being a volunteer. Formal and informal information networks. And the fact is, volunteers bring this to the organization. Those networks can be very significant in terms of fundraising goals, in terms of marketing and promotion, or supporting events. They're critical. Connectivity to and with the community at large, another feature. In terms of weaknesses, probably the single biggest is the factor of time. And Napoleon quite famously said that my generals can ask anything of me and I'll give it to them except for time. And so I think all of us, and especially in our COVID dynamics, are very well aware of time and its challenges. Training is another big feature. Oftentimes, as a volunteer myself, I was thrown into an organization, sometimes with very limited training opportunities. And finally, around recognition, on occasion, I noted that volunteers, or again, myself as a volunteer, we really weren't given the type of recognition I thought was deserving, or relative to what full-time or part-time staff were given. And there are quite a few, but the three most prevalent to me are individual desires and organizational needs. So sometimes there's a disconnect between what the individual brings to the table and what the organization is expecting of them, or what their needs are. The allocating of very limited resources, oftentimes volunteers are in organizations that require them for a variety of reasons, and some of those include financial dynamics. And so there are very limited resources that volunteers can be provided at times. And the final one, and one that's really important, is around the balance between full-time and part-time staff and the volunteers themselves within larger organizations. And on occasion, I found full-time staff are not necessarily as interested in working with volunteers, or they may identify them as being actually a hindrance because they need to be trained, they need to be onboarded, and so those friction points can exist. The three volunteers I knew and still know. And so here again, this is a very oversimplified analysis of volunteers as a collective, but I would say for me, in simple terms, there's three broad categories: the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so really, when we're looking at volunteers, those who are diligent, honest, industrious, folks who get the big picture and are trying their best all of the time, really meet a lot of the criteria that we would like to see in an ideal volunteer, ideal in brackets. The bad are disorganized, or, and I've jokingly said here, the more they try, the worse things get. They often mean well, but they may be late, they may be careless, they may be disinterested. And those are challenging, especially for organizations that have a lot of front-facing work to do in the community. And every single volunteer, especially when they're representing an organization as they go door to door, whether it be the Cancer Society, the Terry Fox Foundation, or any other, the United Way, they are representatives of that organization. So again, when someone's disheveled or disorganized, that can have an absolute impact. And the ugly, and this I'm happy to say is a minority group, and it doesn't happen often, but it happens often enough to be noted. And that's individuals who are participating as a volunteer for the wrong reasons. And they're really not there for the benefit of the organization. They're really more there for the benefit of themselves. An important note that I want to make around interactions with volunteers and onboarding of them or recruiting of volunteers is really the hiring for temperament and alignment with the organization first, and then skill capacity second. And that's not to say that you want to bring someone on who has no skill capacity, but what you're really looking for are excellent individuals who are capable of being trained up. And yes, volunteers can be fired. I've been asked this many times by different organizations. And in many cases, dealing with volunteers as organizations that I'm part of who just aren't fulfilling the obligations, aren't interested in attending or participating in training, aren't really the kind of people that you want in the front of house supporting some of those activities. And volunteers can be fired. So that's something to note and to pay attention to. So what's in it for me or us? Volunteering has been proven to influence a number of key components of an individual's life, connects us to others. It's good for our mind and bodies. It advances our career opportunities, and it brings fun and fulfillment into somebody's life. And there are some really excellent informational pieces there from helpguide.org. I found them to be a tremendous source for a lot of my volunteer developmental needs, and especially around training and development. So let's talk about each of those a little bit, and volunteering and how it connects us to other people and places. And we have to remember that humans, we're fundamentally social in nature. We crave and thrive on those connectivities. Organizations have their own histories and capacities to influence volunteers themselves. I know when I was doing some volunteerism for the Royal Ontario Museum, I couldn't believe the opportunity that I was presented to actually go into the ROM on a Sunday. And I was a volunteer, but I just loved the physical environment itself and all those bits and pieces of historical information that I was so impressed by. And so the fact that I got to attend the ROM for free because I was volunteering that day was very special and important. And those aren't limited to museums, of course. There's so many different environments where just being in that space can influence us in positive ways. And that's what we refer to in leadership talk as the oneness with great places. So being connected as a volunteer in no way diminishes your connectivity to that entity. We just because we're a volunteer doesn't mean we are disconnected in any way. In fact, volunteers may feel a much stronger connection. Some volunteers have been with those organizations for much longer than a number of the full-time staff members have been. It's good for the mind and the body, and this is a really important piece of information. For those of you who are participating in this afternoon's conversation, there's probably no single point that I would like to make more than this. Acts of kindness, and in fact, acts of random kindness in particular, but acts of kindness in general, will boost oxytocin levels within our bloodstream. So tocin rather, is it's a feel-good, it's a natural producing boosting of our overall feelings and emotions. But the biggest thing that it does is it lowers cortisol. So for any of us who are involved in work that's stress related, cortisol is what will enter your bloodstream and presents all kinds of challenges and problems for us. And so by the lowering of cortisol and the addressing of that and cortisol levels in general, the tackling of issues like hypertension, blood pressure, and in general stress overall is significantly enhanced by and boosted by an act of kindness. So in volunteering and in actually witnessing other volunteers also being engaged, we end up benefiting ourselves, our minds and our bodies. In terms of depression and anxiety, there's been a great deal of research on the benefits of volunteering and the capacity of people to actually be involved in movement. For those who have been dealing with depression in their lives, and I'm certainly very familiar in my own family with significant issues of depression, issues around just not wanting to get up, get out, and move is a really important feature. And so volunteering and volunteerism itself allow for that. And finally, that boosted sense of self-worth, which many folks who are dealing with anxiety, depression, high stress are coping with. And volunteering can help to address and ameliorate all of those things. Volunteering can advance our paid careers. So this is something that people don't necessarily want to talk about overtly, but there's no reason why we shouldn't. There are certain things that unequivocally benefit people by participating in volunteering and volunteer-based organizations. One of the biggest is training. In the case of North Simcoe Victim Services, when I came in, one of the things I immediately recognized is that the training program put on by the organization was easily worth $3,000, probably more, who was taking it and how they were looking at it. This was delivered entirely by really high quality instructors and at no cost. They were volunteering their time in order to train up and support our volunteer pool. And that's a absolutely incredible chance for someone to just complete that training and then to be a volunteer within the organization and access that very significant. In the case of Big Brothers Big Sisters, they have, and this is one of their minimal front end training programs, 21-hour 3-day program, incredible ongoing training as well for Big Brothers and Big Sisters. And I'm going to talk more specifically about some of that in a minute. External obligations and responsibilities matter. And so as people are thinking about their own jobs and they say, well, I'm only insert bookkeeper, I'm only a frontline staff member, I'm only a whatever concept student, I'm only a student leader. And what I would often say is in any case where someone feels their current job possibilities don't allow for direct engagement, volunteering is a wonderful opportunity to do that. So many organizations are looking for treasurers, secretaries, external affairs officers. Again, in victim services, I was very involved with trying to help them reconfigure their entire website. So here, opportunities for marketing and direct outreach, all of those are available to folks should they choose. Test driving a career path without making a long-term commitment. In my own case, I was volunteering at the North York Probation and Parole Office, believing I was going to eventually become a probation and parole officer. And what I discovered as a volunteer was that actually not really. I didn't turn out to be the kind of thing I wanted or saw myself doing each and every day. As a volunteer, it wasn't that bad, but recognizing that if I was going to be doing that in a full-time capacity, that probably wasn't going to be a good long-term fit for me. So the fact I was able to explore that possibility and figure that out before I perhaps invested a very substantial component of my life in doing it made a lot of sense. And I was blessed for that chance. And finally, networking and relationship building, and being able to connect with people within those organizations. Many of the volunteer organizations that I have been connected with present all kinds of linkages and opportunities. And again, Doug Downey is an example of that. Doug Downey was chair of Big Brothers Big Sisters in Aurelia, and he's currently the Attorney General of Ontario. And I know Doug through Big Brothers Big Sisters. So that's just one example of where network relationships can emerge that we might not have been planning for or expecting, but they are there, and they can absolutely enable us to leverage down the road. Volunteering can be fun, but it should always be fulfilling. I mean, in an ideal scenario, you want to, whether it's volunteerism and volunteer capacity or work, we want to actually be enjoying what we do. And these opportunities through volunteer capacities allow that to happen. It gives variety to our normal day-to-day routines, gives purpose, and aligns our hopes and desires for a better tomorrow. So again, from a leadership perspective, most of us who are volunteering care very significantly about the organization, and depending on the organization, what it's trying to do within the broader community and how we can be an active participant in that. So our desires for a better tomorrow fundamentally start with a desire, an opportunity, and engagement as a volunteer and choosing to be connected to those organizations. So how do we make that relationship work? It starts with recognizing that the volunteering opportunity is a shared experience. And I consider this to going whitewater rafting. And there's a great analogy provided by Peter Vale, who talks about living as whitewater rafting. And within a whitewater rafting experience, you have two real choices that you can make. Once you're in the boat, your two choices are to really be enthusiastic about what's about to happen, the experience that you're in, or to be terrified and say, hey, I want to get off. And when you're in a boat, and I've been there, you really should opt for the enthusiasm, because the truth of the matter is you're in that boat, you're in the white water, and we are all experiencing that as a shared experience. Clarity is the key. So clear role expectations and outcomes are vital to a positive volunteer engagement. When there is a lack of clarity, that's really where things can be difficult and problematic. Timely, regular, honest communication, avoiding or exceeding design parameters. So this would be, in computer speak, operating within the framework. Sometimes within volunteer organizations, I've had volunteers present themselves, and their job, their task might have been, let's say, marketing a promotion, but they're really keen to do finance, and suddenly they begin to bleed over into financial affairs, and then they want to talk to staff every day about other components of their volunteer experience. And so as a former volunteer coordinator, there was a lot of intentionality that goes into the design of the actual role, and being really clear with the volunteers themselves about how that fits and how it fits for the organization. It's all part of being as honest as possible. And I say, starting with you. So whether you're the volunteer coordinator or a volunteer or the executive director, or an associate vice president, it's being as honest as possible about what you're looking for those volunteers to do and what they are looking for in terms of a return. Recognizing the various roles that we all play. So again, when I've been a volunteer coordinator, making sure there was absolute alignment with my executive director about what the roles of the volunteers were, and in some cases what they're not. And so ensuring that people are playing within their respective laneways as we all go in the same direction is really important. I would also just emphasize that whether you're a volunteer coordinator or an executive director, they're people too. And they're dealing with some really substantive challenges. You've got high turnover, numerous internal and external accountability measures, got lots of rules and regulations. When we were dealing with North Simcoe Victim Services, we were primarily responsible for the Ministry of the Attorney General, or MAG, and we had to provide them with any variation of $150 on budget. And so if you have a volunteer that's heading up an event or a project and they come back and say, hey, Frank, sorry, we just went over by $300, that actually presents a major issue, because we've got to then do a ton of paperwork to present reasons why that happens to be the case. So family responsibilities, lifelong learning, and new technologies are all facing both organizations and volunteers themselves. Today's conversation is happening through Zoom, and so any variety of things may go wrong because we've got great people helping us today. It won't, but these are the challenges that we're all dealing with. And finally, collective agreements, FIPA, AODA, all of these requirements that are and fall under volunteers as well. In the case of Lakehead, we have expectations that anyone who is supporting us, engaging with us as a university, even volunteers, have to fill and fulfill our employee standards in terms of interactions with others, their interface with the community, how they will conduct themselves. So these expectations are often on the shoulders of executive directors and many within the community who work tremendous hours. I've been so impressed and humbled by the executive directors that I've seen, general managers, chief operating officers at the various organizations I've been part of. To a person, they are working 55, 65 hours a week, doing tremendous things with often very little in terms of remuneration. So my hat's off to any of you today who are fulfilling those roles right now. There is a lot of research out there, and there's some tremendous sites that provide great links. There's no reason to rebuild or redesign. In the world of volunteerism, there's tremendous asset capacity and information transference. One of those is around Charity Village, and Charity Village has a very substantive set of things on their website, but also opportunities for volunteers. And so either as an organization or as a volunteer yourself, you can connect to them very easily. Volunteer Canada is a great website, provides, again, a ton of information, a lot of technical data, and some good guidelines. So if you're an organizational lead and you're trying to boost the number of volunteers within your respective organization, Volunteer Canada and all of the information provided there is a great resource tool. Helpingguide.org and the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership. So just a quick plug on the servant leadership front. For those of us who teach leadership and are engaged as leaders, one of the schools of leadership is called servant leadership. And servant leadership is really founded by Dr. Robert Greenleaf. And what he would say is the greatest acts of leadership emerge when we are in service to others. So it's in that act of serving others that our greatest leadership potentials emerge. And I actually wholeheartedly agree with Dr. Greenleaf on that. And the School of Servant Leadership for me has been one that I've actively engaged myself in learning more about and being a participant in. So something to think about, the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership, great resource tool. So here I am with a couple of wonderful people, and right beside me there is Marian Roxilakowski, who was our former Vice Provost of Student Affairs, and James Maxwell, who was the Executive Director of Big Brothers Big Sisters in Aurelia. And this was at the Celebration of Mentoring event where we at Lakehead Aurelia received the Scholastic Partnership Award. It was something I was really, really proud of, in part because here we are, a tiny little campus, quote unquote, 1,200 full-time students at the time, and we beat out some very, very big schools, substantive schools, and Scholastic partners to get this national award. And so let me just talk about the partnership a little bit, because it's an example of the kind of connections that can make sense and can be tremendously beneficial both to an organization and to an institution. James Maxwell and I have been friends for a long time. We've talked for years how we can benefit and improve and continue to strengthen the Aurelia community and Simcoe County more broadly. And James came to me one day indicating that Big Brothers and Big Sisters was doing tremendously well in terms of their outreach to the community. They had just done a magnificent marketing campaign. They'd done very well in terms of fundraising. But the challenge, the issue that generated was they didn't have enough supply to meet for Big Brother or Big Sister mentors, and they just weren't in a position to support those folks. So what ended up happening was they had a waiting list of about 30 families who were looking for a big brother or a big sister. And he asked what I or Lakehead could do to assist him in trying to address that shortfall. And really, and quite honestly, on a handshake, what I said was that we absolutely would help and could help, and through student affairs, enabled James to put together a personalized message that we sent on his behalf to all of our prospective students and also returning students at the beginning of the year. We also provided big brothers and big sisters with an opportunity to actually attend orientation and to have a booth set up and to work with us in trying to boost their own participation rate. Of course, because we've got our wonderful School of Social Work in Aurelia and a number of those students who already had some relationship with big brothers, big sisters, we leveraged that partnership and made sure that our School of Social Work, our Faculty of Education, I mean, any student in general could participate. But we really wanted to use those levers in front of us to maximize the connectivity points. And what ended up happening actually surprised James and surprised me, because as I indicated before, we had 1,200 students in total, and out of that 1,200 pool, 100 actually responded saying they would be interested. And actually, at the end, we had a number of those 100 students actually fully complete the training, be engaged, and directly work with James and Big Brothers Big Sisters to meet all of the shortfalls. So the 40 family shortfall was met and actually exceeded. And we had a volunteer group that was really committed to working with Big Brothers and Big Sisters, not just in that particular year, but actually every year down the road. As we kept building on that partnership, we then expanded it to include a number of co-op opportunities. So as our students were looking for co-op through the School of Social Work, we ensured that Big Brothers Big Sisters actually had a priority placement, and we would try to give as many positions as they sought out. My last sort of year that I was directly involved with, I know 6 of our students were working actually as volunteers within Big Brothers Big Sisters in one shape or format within their office. So that is a very, very quick overview of volunteering, and how its strengths and weaknesses can apply, whether you are someone as a volunteer or you're looking to boost your volunteer capacity within an organization. Irregardless or irrespective of where you are, these tools, I think, my little bits of information that I provided will certainly aid you in that process of identifying and strengthening the linkages that you have already or that you're trying to build within the organizations that you're part of, or as an individual, the volunteer connectivities that you'd like to make. So with that, what I'd like to do is actually open the floor, and I am going to stop my sharing at this point so I can actually see the room a bit, and we can, what I hope will be, have a very good conversation.
Thanks, Frank, so much. This was very informative, great presentation. We have questions pouring in, so I'm just going to read them off to you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so you brought in a lot of personal experiences during the presentation, which I found very interesting. So this is more of a personal question.
Sure.
What was your most memorable volunteer experience?
That's a good one. That is actually a really good question. Probably for me, I would have to say when I was chairing North Simcoe Victim Services. And so, here I came on the board. The truth was I arrived at Victim Services and I just expected to be a board member. I was keen to support the organization because my sister was very involved with Victim Services in Toronto. And so in sort of honor of my sister, Sandy, I brought that engagement up to Aurelia. And after the first meeting, the question was posed to me as whether I'd like to be chair going forward. I have to remember that meeting with a lot of real sort of surprise because I was like, hey, I just arrived. But the chair who recruited me was had other intentions, and I realized afterwards he was gracious enough to stay for a year and train me. But that interaction and almost immediately realizing how much work was being done in the community by Victim Services that I had no idea about. So here was an organization doing great work, but it hadn't it felt it really shouldn't market itself because of the work it was doing. It was saying, well, we're dealing with victims, which is a very confidential issue, and yet, but so therefore, how do we market? And I had to turn around and say that I felt rather than victims, these were tremendous survivors who have great stories to tell and are really have achieved wonderful things post-event. And so that was for me what I think as chair, I helped to manifest some of that. But that was a great experience, that first experience, and I stuck around. So it was a good experience.
Yeah, no kidding. The next question is similar to that, and maybe it's the same example you provided, but they wanted to know your most proud moment.
Oh, okay. Well, for me, Terry Fox developed brain cancer, and so I committed to. I'm sorry, my internet's saying it's unstable. I hope I don't cut out too much. I made a commitment when she lost her hair that I would cut my hair as well, and I did that. I also respected Terry Fox, enormous respect and admiration for Terry as an individual, as a leader, as a volunteer. And so then I decided to cut my hair, but I took that a step further and I introduced that concept to York University. And so we did the annual head shave at York, and that as a first time moment, I managed to raise $5,000. Just extend that out to say, I've brought that tradition to Lakehead. At Lakehead. So it's sorry, everybody froze.
That's okay. Yeah, it's a little bit choppy.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. I think it's good now on our end.
Okay. Okay. So go ahead, ask another.
Yeah, I love that initiative. It's just such a nice gesture when you see people do that when they're going through such a devastating thing. Okay, so next question is, if you don't have much time, but you still want to help an organization, what do you suggest you can do? How could you help?
That's an excellent question. And it's one, often people make the mistake of assuming, like, I don't have X amount of time per week or per month. And perhaps a job posting, because sometimes you'll see a volunteer job posting and it says, up to 12 hours a month or up to 15 hours or whatever the case may be. And the right place, the first thing to do is actually speak to the executive director, the volunteer coordinator, and explain literally that. So this is what I mean by having honest conversations, right? And saying, listen, Mark, I really want to be involved, but I find that I've only got 3 hours that I could provide a week. Do you think that could fit in somewhere? And here's what I'm thinking. And it's really through those conversations. We have to remember that often volunteer organizations are putting out, as do any large organization, a set sort of criteria. They've got a guideline for what their ideal involvement might look like. But if someone says, hey, I can only put in 3 hours and they are someone that's going to be a net contributor to the organization, oh boy, we're going to grab them. The other thing that people don't realize is that often these board meetings, the board meetings themselves are open. They're open to the public. And so I would often have someone say, hey, Frank, I'd love to take minutes or something, but that's about all I can do, right? But I'm not on the board. So here's a statement, I'm not on the board. Well, often again, we have opportunities to engage people as volunteers. You don't have to be on the board. You can be an adjunct member. You can be a non-voting member. Boards can be expanded in some cases. I've been on boards and said, hey, we really want this person. Hey, how does everyone feel about expanding? So those possibilities are all available, but it all starts with a healthy conversation.
Absolutely. The next question is, what is your best advice for someone who wants to volunteer, but they're afraid? They don't have enough time. They don't know the board, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, fear is such an interesting thing, and it can create all kinds of challenges for us. I mean, we will sometimes put our own barriers in front of a decision, and I'm guilty of that myself. one of the things that we have to do is ask, what is it that I'd like to achieve? What is it that I would like to actually accomplish? And then how do I do that? And so, you know, by asking the first question, so what is it that I really want to achieve? What is it, you know, I'd really like to raise $100,000 for the Terry Fox Foundation. So the next question is, well, then how do I do that? And fear can be a motivator as well. You know, I'll give you an example. One year, as I was raising funds, I was caught in my own personal dynamics, and I got off to a very late start. And so instead of really being able to hit the bushes and push my buddies to donate, I wasn't going to meet my target. You know, I had set $750 as my target, and I wasn't going to hit it. And I had two decisions to make. My first was that I would literally, you know, who would know, right? I would just lower the target number, and now I've hit my target. I would simply take it from 750 down to 700, and who would know? And the answer is I would know. Like I would know that. And this was literally what I said. I said, what would Terry do? Right? Because this was for the Terry Fox Foundation. I said, what would Terry do? And the answer I got back was he'd up the amount. And that's what I did. I actually took it from $750 to $900, and I put an email out telling that exact story, and I exceeded that $900 target. And so that's an example of where, and that's taken years. I don't want to pretend that that just came by fluke. That was years of me really practicing, taking what I was afraid of and using that as fuel to get myself to a different place. And so that's exactly what I would say. Anything that we are attracted to or we are averse to, so attraction and aversion, those are things we need to spend some time asking about. But certainly the things we're fearful of can oftentimes be angels in disguise. So that would be my answer to that.
That's great. And I'm glad that question was asked, because that is a very good piece of advice and a neat little story that people can take on in their own lives. I had never heard anyways of someone doing that. So that's a good point you brought up. This is a great question. A lot of people start to volunteer, and they're in their experience, how does an organization inspire their volunteers to continue to stay involved?
Okay, great question. So you've got a group of volunteers, and they start off much like staff, by the way, very enthusiastic, and they've got all kinds of energy and ideas and various motivations. And then over time, some of that can wane, and that's a natural cycle, by the way. So one thing to point out first is that that's natural and normal. It's not actually a bad thing in and of itself. It's part of the dynamics of the organization. The second is looking at points of intersection. So when you're onboarding someone, you've invested a lot of time in them, and that interface, right? So they're seeing me all the time, and we're having these great conversations. And now I've put them in front of a desk, or I've put them in front of a house, or I've put them in front of something, and they're doing the actual work. And so points of intersection are really important. How am I circling back as a leader to make sure those volunteers are doing okay? Because some volunteers just aren't going to tell you that they're not enthusiastic anymore. They're just not going to bring that up because, hey, you know, I know Frank's a busy guy, and I don't want to be a drag here, so I'll just be quiet, or I'll just quit. And that happens, right? So points of engagement are really important. So timely, regular interface, opportunities to get feedback from volunteers, and to do that both in a anonymous and non-anonymous fashion. So surveys are really good tools, right? How are things going? How are you finding, you know, what can we do to improve your volunteer experience? And asking that through anonymous methods can be really good. And also circling back as a smaller group. Hey, every month from 3 to 5 on Thursday, I'm simply going to have an open 2 hours for volunteers, and any of you can log in, and we're just going to have a meet and greet. We're just going to have a chat about how things are going and about the organization at large. And here's the other piece. We, as executive directors or general managers, I mean, Mark's on the screen, I can see him. We have to be very interested in what our volunteers have got to say to us, and how we're going to take that information and filter it into an action plan. So if a volunteer, or God forbid, more than one, is telling me, hey, there's some stuff here that we're not, you know, so happy about, Frank, I need to know what that is, and I need to know what their solutions might be. So something that I've often talked about with my own team is about solution building. So how are we going to fix that? Because, you know, the reason they exist as volunteers in many respects is because the organization needs them, and we don't have capacity to hire 70 other people. We need these volunteers to be engaged, active participants. And so what can we do to make them more valuable? So regular timely feedback, regular check-ins, and finally, recognition. The thing that I will kudos to the Alumni Association for the work that it does, because some great recognition events and great opportunities to recognize the volunteers who are contributing their time. And again, not necessarily differentiating between the volunteer who's only able to give the 3 hours a week versus the other who's retired, who's happy to give 30 hours a week. But recognizing that both of those volunteers play a pivotal role. There is a special place for volunteers who are really going above and beyond, as there is for volunteers who are giving a lot of good intellectual capabilities and capacities.
Great, thanks. Thanks. I noticed Mark has his hand up, so maybe we'll end it off with Mark's question, and then the rest of the questions, I will provide your email, and
Sure.
these people can get in contact with you directly. But Mark?
Hey, Frank, how are you doing?
Great, Mark. How are you?
Not too bad. Thanks so much for doing the presentation today. I have to say that every time I listen to you speak, I learn something new, and oftentimes multiple things new. And the one thing that I picked up on, and it was right at the very beginning of your presentation, and you talked a little bit about the Canadian Code of Voluntary Involvement or Volunteer Involvement, something like that. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that. And I'm thinking about it in the context of, are organizations that use volunteers being asked to adopt this code, very much like Lakehead has a donor bill of rights.
Yes.
And it spells out for the donors, you know, what we expect of them and what they can expect from us. Same thing for the new code?
Yes, absolutely. The code is set to provide what is considered best practice with organizations that are using volunteers. So it sets out a set of criteria that says, you know, volunteers should be onboarded appropriately, recognized regularly, given adequate PPE, you know, if they're out in the community, etc. So it sets some really good baselines for what an organization that's working with volunteers should be doing day to day, but also set some guidelines for long-term growth and potentialities. So, for example, one of the friction points that's come up in the past, and I've been party to those conversations, are staff members saying, "Hey, you've got all these volunteers running around, Frank. Are these guys going to take my job? You know, are these guys doing my work?" And so there is an example of where really clear delineations between, you know, the work of full-time staff, which is pivotally important, and the work of volunteers, which is not diminishing, it's an add-on, right? But the code presents some guidance about that, and that, you know, no organization should be bringing volunteers on with the goal of reducing its full-time staffing. So I give you that as an example. And there should be, again, from an ethical standpoint, we would say, well, that's a given, Frank, right? But we all know that within the broader context, there are some charities that sometimes do things that are interesting. And so the code does also provide some guidelines to say, hey, these are the best practices that should be employed. And it spells it out very nicely, actually.
Excellent. I think there's a couple of folks on the call that will be looking up that code and its applications for what we do on a daily basis.
Wonderful.
Thanks again for that.
You're welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Mark, for that question. And that wraps up our presentation. Thank you, Frank, for taking the time away to present to us all this wonderful information that you have. So it's very much appreciated.